Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure for me to open up this very important webinar, which is focusing on the partnership and the need for faith, science, and youth to come together. I would very much like to welcome all of you as distinguished guests and also our distinguished speakers. My name is Sandrine Dixon de Cleve, and I'm the co-president of the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome that, like the Vatican, is located in Rome and has tried for many, many years to talk about the importance of preserving people, planet, and prosperity. If we look at the words of the Laudato Si, and if we look at the words of Pope Francis himself, we know that we are in the midst of the Anthropocene, but we need to shift from anthropocentrism into a new people, planet, prosperity dynamic, a paradigm shift that is going to look right now at the importance of the pandemic that is actually impacting our lives and livelihoods, the crisis that is before us in terms of climate change, and also the biodiversity crisis. This convergence of tipping points needs absolutely all actors to work together. It is so important that the voice of faith leaders is actually heard on the importance of preserving the planet that we have and ensuring that people can live a more profitable, prosperous, and healthy life. So this session, I think, is incredibly important. And I think it will set the stage, I hope, until COP26, which is our next big negotiation on climate change, for further and future conversations around the planetary emergency that's before us. The Club of Rome, alongside the Potsdam Institute, and that's why I'm so pleased that Professor Schellnhuber is also on this webinar, have pledged to work together around ensuring that we move fast in covering at least 50% of our emission reductions over the next 10 years, and then the next 10, and then the next 10. And that we ensure that we meet our climate neutrality goals and our Paris Agreement goals. In order for scientists to continue to promote and push this very important objective, we need to work together with faith leaders and the youth. And that is why it's so important that both Hindou, Oumarou, and also Cardinal Turkson are part of the conversation today. It is through this partnership of passionate activists, of people who understand the need to shift the bar, that we can no longer wait, but must act during this decade of action, at a time when COVID has shown us that going back to essential is absolutely fundamental. Making sure that people have access to healthcare, making sure that people have access to clean water, clean air, healthy food, and in particular, can continue to prosper alongside the planetary boundaries. So I am going to open up this webinar now and start with a question to Hindou. Hindou, who is coming to us from Cameroon and has been working in the area of voicing the concerns of Indigenous people and Africans and the importance of ensuring the conservation of the planetary boundaries and nature and most of the livelihoods. So, Hindou, my question to you is, the pandemic should serve as a wake-up call to better protect nature, to save ourselves. What is your work demonstrating in order to show this? What do you feel world leaders must do, civil society and business? What is your call to action?
Thank you very much, Sandrine. I would like firstly to really thank also Vatican for the leadership that they have around all the crises, the moral, spiritual, and call for action to all of us for fighting climate change. To come back to your question, Sandrine, we all know that the climate change is impact the most vulnerable. And that's why I am also fighting for my communities, fighting for indigenous peoples around the world who do not create the climate change, but who are the most impacted. We all know also our life and livelihood are dependent from nature. If we do not respect nature, we do not respect even ourselves, because nature is giving us food, giving us water, giving us clean air. And you said well, Sandrine. But with the COVID-19, it is increasing what's already are vulnerables this is the most vulnerable communities. So COVID-19 is becoming a big driver of the food insecurity in my country, in my community. Because when they close the borders and they establish the new socials issues to say you have to wash your hand 4 times a day, people who do not get access to clean water to drink, they cannot wash them hands. It's not just. When they close the border, when we are nomadic, we used to follow the rain. They cannot close the rain from coming. They cannot close all the season to continuous. And that means we cannot cross the border to get the water and pastures. So it makes the peoples more vulnerable again. So that's why, for me, when we have the climate change, it is a duty to fight, to keep all the environment, the nature to be healthy. So that's my call to the leaders, as you said, to the private sector, to the youth. There is no sustainable business or sustainable life without the sustainable nature. If we do not respect nature, our health will be in a big problem. And that's the pandemic, where they come from. If we do not protect nature, we cannot build a sustainable economy, because we are seeing that the economies are crashing around all the world. But we must use the nature as the broader umbrella for the survival of each species. As human beings, we are only one species of the nature. And that's how indigenous people's wisdom are coming to these discussions and showing that it is very important to protect nature, and nature will protect our health back. So this is my call for them, Sandrine. You are muted.
Thank you. I think your point on we are all as vulnerable as the people that are most vulnerable. It is that value chain, that understanding of our dependency on nature that is fundamental as we move forward, because we know that COVID is a zoonotic disease and is also coming from the fact that our biodiversity loss alongside climate change is hitting at the same time. What has been for you a really important learning from the pandemic in terms of, do you feel, we talk often here in Europe of greater solidarity, of a better understanding of why we are so vulnerable, of being more pulled towards what's essential. What have you seen in the African continent and also in your discussions?
So Sandrine, this is a greater question, because we can learn a lot of lessons from the COVID pandemic. We can turn it into the opportunity to protect better our nature, to fight against climate change. When the pandemic started, all the world leaders from Africa and from the rest of the world come up with one positions. We need to protect people. We need to protect everyone, and we need to focus on the most vulnerable. They put the groups or the elders of those who cannot get access to say we need to come in solidarity and protect all the peoples. And then the second thing that come with it together, it's how they can mobilize a scientific peoples to build up a solutions, and that's called the vaccine. That's the one they are all working on it from every corner of the world. And this fit the news of our channels since last week. Every scientific are coming up with a new vaccine to give access to the communities. The third one, it's peoples everywhere, the leaders are investing by giving a funding, how they can reboost the economy. Billions from EU to US to Asian countries are committed to reboost the economy. So those are a concrete lesson and action that we need to take over to the climate change, because in climate change, there is no vaccine. The scientists start telling them before I get born that they are alarming them. We have to stop the greenhouse gases. We need to protect our planet, but no one listens. Scientific can just to give them evidence on climate change. Maybe they can build a solution through technology, but they cannot rebuild the nature. Who will rebuild the nature? are the peoples who are living on it. So they need to learn from the COVID-19, to listen from the scientific who are designing the vaccine for COVID. They can listen for them. They are alarming us to design urgent actions, and they need to mobilize the funding. You know, we are so lucky to be in this panel because it's the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. But if we think about the funding, the 100 billions that was committed by the end of these years to the developing countries, we do not see it reach it. No. But when we see the funding of the COVID, they are billions. Why they cannot shift and integrate climate change to the COVID? And then we can save lives. We can save human being, plant, herb, food securities, insect, and we can give the right to the planet to get restart and save all of us in this earth.
Hindou, you've said so many wise things, and I'm going to build on that as we move through this, because I think that, first of all, you've indicated that we don't have a vaccine for climate change. And we also know that we can't build back better if we have glaciers that have already melted or forests that have already been chopped down. But most importantly, and I'm going to come to you now, Professor Schellnhuber, because of all your incredible work in science, as Hindou says, we have a very sick planet, but we don't have a vaccine. What is the science telling you now as we move forward? And what does that mean for world leaders? Are we going fast enough? Are we putting forward the comparable targets and timetables that we need, especially on this Paris Agreement anniversary?
Okay, so thank you, Sandrine. I just try actually to set up my presentation. Does it work?
It does.
Okay, wonderful. So even the technology helps us to move forward on this. So it's a pleasure to be here with you. And yes, I'm representing the scientific evidence, which was referred to very ardently by Hindou regarding the COVID-19 crisis. So very briefly, 5 years after the Paris Agreement was struck. So may I remind you the jubilant final scene during the COP21 in 2015. And there are many question marks about this event, but what really transpired was that we will try to keep global warming below 2 degrees. And actually, as the IPCC has confirmed, we should even try to aim for a guardrail of 1.5 degrees. Why is it so? So this is not a mystical target. It is grounded in deep science. And I give you just one explanation for that. So let me see, this is the map I have been traveling with for 2 decades now about the tipping elements in the Earth system. And just one illustration, this is what could go terribly wrong on this planet if we keep on warming it by 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees actually. Yeah, I give you just one illustration on that. That is the Greenland ice sheet. If the Greenland ice sheet melts down in an irreversible way, that was also mentioned before, then it will add 7 meters to global sea level, and many coastal zones in the world become uninhabitable. And you can imagine the misery, the human misery that will come from it. So I give you just one illustration. We have lots of new evidence now that somewhere above 2 degrees actually, Greenland will melt down, and the writing on the wall is, and this is a mind-boggling insight actually, that in the last year, 2019, the Greenland ice sheet lost 1 million tons of ice per minute. You have to imagine this, 1 million tons per minute. This cannot be undone by some smart technology. You either stop this process in general, or actually we are screwed to use it, to put it in a brutal way. So this is the situation. And now what is happening? Let's have a look at the map. This is the latest insight from the Climate Change Performance Index done by German Watch. It was published yesterday. And more or less in color coding, if you look at this world map, The only countries that are to some extent, not fully, but to some extent in line with the Paris Agreement are the green ones you can see on the map. So the usual suspects, Scandinavian countries, of course, but very interesting, also Morocco, for example, and India. So that's very important, and Chile, yeah? So it's not just the industrialized countries. Actually, it's quite the reverse. If you look at the industrialized, the heavily industrialized countries, European Union is doing so-so, but US and Russia are more or less hopeless in this context. So here is where the big action has to happen. And this is also something Hindou referred to. Now, maybe the Corona crisis will come to the rescue. So that was an assumption many people have done. So at least, apart from the human misery which is wreaked upon this planet, will at least emissions drop in a way that we will have a much easier way to sort of stabilize the climate in accordance with the Paris Agreement. Now, we published this very recently in Nature Communications and showing that in the first half of 2020, emissions actually fell by about 9%. But this is just nothing actually in the overall rise of the concentration. If you go to the famous Mauna Loa curve, for example, you see it's just going on. It does not even take notice of the emission reductions which are sort of set into operation by the COVID measures. So this will not come to the rescue. We will not escape from global warming because of the emissions reduced by the Corona measures. So we have to do it in a systemic way, not in a crisis mode, but we have to do it with determination in a sustainable way for the next 50 years or something. Yeah? So what needs to be done? Well, we have to actually halve emissions every decade now. That's our carbon law, if you like. It's very important. Every decade we have to halve emissions. And here is something very interesting. So I could speak, of course, now about photovoltaics and wind turbines and all the stuff. This is more or less a done deal. I'm absolutely sure we will switch to renewable power, for example, in the next 2 decades, more or less, for cost reasons, for example. But what is absolutely important is the so-called second frontier, that is the biospheric carbon sinks. You know, if we keep cutting forests down, when we are adding CO2 to the atmosphere, and we are actually destroying the capacity of nature to help us on the way, namely by absorbing CO2. That is the craziest, the maddest thing you can do. So the only friends we have on Earth, that is the natural ecosystems, we are killing them. It's absolutely crazy, and it was discussed, and I gave a webinar actually on that in the Amazonia Synod last year, and actually in a seminar, Querida Amazonia, the Ecclesial Networks Alliance, very recently were referred to that. Now there's an interesting thing. I mean, I could talk about all the measures we need to do, CO2 pricing and all that, but actually there's a very interesting option. We want to protect nature, but actually nature can help us in doing that. And this is a very interesting thing, namely the elephant in the climate room so far, responsible for more than 40% of all emissions, is the constructing and operating of buildings and infrastructure. So this is the climate elephant, so to speak. It has not been addressed in any way, apart from some insulation techniques for facades and things like that. But we have now shown in a recent paper, which I'm very proud of actually to be part of that group, that we can turn buildings into a global carbon sink. Why? Because we can switch from concrete and steel and glass and chemicals to organic materials. And by doing that, we can actually even compensate a lot of historical emissions. So it's, I would call it the forestry construction pump, and we can operate it even if we have gone beyond 1.5 degrees. We can bring back in a way the global climate to closer to the pre-industrial level. So that's a golden opportunity and a silver bullet, if you like. And I'm very proud and very happy that this has been picked up by the President of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen. So please refer to her State of the Union speech of 16th of September. I think it's a very remarkable speech. And she has completely endorsed that and said, we have to create something like a new Bauhaus movement. We have to transform the built environment in style. So it's also a question of art, of aesthetics, of culture and things like that. So let me end with the following proposal to the Catholic Church, actually. Apart from heeding the evidence provided by the scientific community, we do it through the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, for example. Now, it would be a very strong statement if the Catholic Church would start to build all their buildings, all their premises from wood in the future. Start from now and give up to build from concrete, go for organic materials in line with nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Schellnhuber. And you bring up a very important point, which is that some of our thinking is being adopted by leaders such as Ursula von der Leyen as President of the European Commission. And I think both of us who were counseled by the President were so pleased to see that she took on the need to both look at the shift from wealth to well-being and indicate that we had to design the future environment that we wanted to see. A future environment that both makes people healthy, happy, and the planet thriving at the same time. And I think that that is the message that we want to bring to the Catholic Church, a church which also is trying to understand this complexity. And Cardinal Turkson, I will turn to you because we know that this webinar is being organized by the Vatican's COVID-19 Commission. And we also know that there is an interrelationship between the pandemic, biodiversity loss, and climate change, and that nature is absolutely fundamental. In your view, and also in the view of the Catholic Church, and under the great leadership of Pope Francis, what for you is the most important in terms of his words within the Laudato Si? What does that say to world leaders, to civil society, and to business? And how can we bring that forward together collectively in 2021 in light of the work that you're also undertaking with the COVID-19 Commission?
Thank you for inviting us and having us be part of this. I think all of Vatican is on board with this. Tomorrow it continues with the Secretary of State and all. The sentiments and the great concern that the Vatican has had in this, on this, the preparation of the first COVID-21, and now its anniversary has been great. We ourselves are glad to have been able to participate at the COP21 in Paris and be able to present, the encyclical letter of Laudato Si at that event and make it a stimulant for the discussion and everything that happened over there. Pope Francis did write in the encyclical letter Laudato Si that one of the biggest challenges he had was how to interpret the scientific data, in support of climate change and all. But as we just listened to Professor Schellnhuber, he and his colleagues, and very many more who are still working, continue to urge us on. Right after the publication of Laudato Si, I had a chance of presenting this encyclical at Boston College, in the United States. And I had to share a platform with the climate scientists of the Obama regime. And the task was to see where the Pope overstated data or where he understated, terms. And so after my presentation, this climate scientist came and said, the Holy Father could have said things a little bit more strongly. So he could have said it more, because the challenge we face initially started with the arguments about what is Anthropocene and whether it is true or it's not true. Now I think the conviction is there. Everybody sees is that everything that is happening is induced by human nature. Pope Francis said at the beginning of his encyclical Laudato Si that the violence that is within the human heart, that's what is playing out on these other elements and how we treat the environment, how we treat the poor, how we treat the rivers and mountains and all of that. So there is a need for an ecological conversion, as Pope Francis puts it in the encyclical Laudato Si. We need to change. And when we need to change, when the Pope talks about needing to change, it's not engaging in an idle discourse. He knows very well what he's talking about. And this call to change is being reinforced by the COVID, crisis. So we are dealing with two crises, self-reinforcing, so that as the Pope says, really nobody emerges from a crisis the same way. Indeed, we should endeavor not to emerge from crisis the same way. That means we need to learn the lessons of the crisis we've just gone through. And in this regard, Pope Francis echoes very much his predecessor, who had also handled the crisis, although it was not climate and it was not COVID or healthcare. He had handled the crisis of economics, the economic crash of the 2008 and 9. And what Pope Benedict said at that time was this, that every crisis obliges us to replan our journeys. Every crisis invites us to build new models, to reject questionable conduct of life and practice and engage in new ones. So it's a time to reimagine, to replan, and to set new models. And that is the big thing that the Holy Father invites us. So his call to ecological conversion invites us all first to recognize our role as ecological citizens. All of us are ecological citizens because our lives and the ecology are interconnected. And that is why we need to recognize that the nature of the climate impacts negatively on our health. This was stated by a delegation that flew from the United States to us when they learned that we're going to do an encyclical on ecology. They prayed and begged us not to skip the issue of healthcare when we're talking about climate and everything that can happen to climate. Indeed, climate does have a big impact on our environment and the healthcare of each individual of us. At that time, when they came to us, nobody knew about COVID. Nobody knew about COVID. But COVID has come to reinforce the fact that our disregard of environmental abuses and all of that make us come too close to disturbing the biomane system, the biodiversity system, to say that we can provoke some more disasters affecting us. Hindou talked about challenges with water and food supply. So it is also with clean breathing air and the effect on the lungs. COVID attacks the lungs first, but the lungs which already rendered, as it were, sick by dirty air, the air that we breathe and all of that, becomes an easy victim to the concern of the COVID. So the concern of Pope Francis to all of us is to change, is to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And the poor in this case include also the healthcare deprived issues and all who suffer, as it were, dignity deficit in all the very many systems that make our lives, take and turn. And so that's what we come to this with. Having participated in COP21, where we try to get countries to commit to this, it's a blessing to come to this anniversary, but unfortunately not come with a record that enables us to rejoice at having achieved something like climate change. The climate scientists are telling us that we are towards 3-degree rise in temperature change. At COP21 in Paris, we're fighting to stay within maximum 2 degrees, and now we're going towards that 3. So we're not doing too well. We cannot applaud ourselves and we cannot tap ourselves on the back and say we've done well. We need to commit still more strongly to committing to those type of changes we need to cause carbon sink, increase better practices of greening the world, all of it to make the world a better place, healthier for us, and sustainable for our lives.
Thank you so much, Cardinal, for your words of wisdom. I could not agree more, and I'm sure that Professor Schellnhuber and Hindou all of us were actually in Paris together.
Okay.
And
Okay.
we all had hoped that today would be a day where we could embrace real change, real systems change, and a healthy planet for healthy people. And we're seeing that not only is that not the case, but now the COVID pandemic has demonstrated that our planet and our people are increasingly sick together, which puts a huge strain. I would like to come back to you, Cardinal, and also to Professor Schellnhuber and Hindou for a few thoughts. And we've got some questions here that have been asked.
Okay.
But the first would be to you, Cardinal. As you indicated so rightly, that the leadership of the Catholic Church is to shift models. What do you think of this proposal from Professor Schellnhuber in terms of really changing your buildings and turning them into carbon sinks? I would add to that there's a question here around your thinking and the church's thinking around nuclear power. So maybe you can answer those two questions together. And I know that the nuclear one is a bit of a controversial one.
No, okay. No, it is true. It is true. Bending the curve of temperature rise down is also changing a lot of, models of lifestyle models and all of that. So it is true. If we depended more on solar energy, for example, would be contributing to a climate, temperature, reducing temperature rise and carbon sink. If we resorted a lot more dependence on, energy developed by wind, that'll be on the positive turn. If we adopted, for example, the Polish practice of celebrating birthdays with planting trees, that would be a great, thing to also to develop. If we promoted this green belt from Dakar to Djibouti, that would also, so all of these practices are very wholesome practices that contribute to our bending down the curve of temperature rise. So I agree perfectly with Professor Schellnhuber. We need to change lifestyle. We need to change lifestyle, some of which have been adopted as norms and giving us the impression that if we modified or tempered with this lifestyle, we will not survive. But that's not true. That's not true. At Davos, at one event, we were treated to a meat-free meal. That still tasted as if you were eating meat. So again, because people have said that, breeding cows and animals contribute a lot to this carbon, production and all of that. So yes, a change in lifestyle is very crucial. And not only in changing lifestyle, but our architecture must also change. Our city-urban planning must also change. Our rooftop gardens must become a thing of every household, so that all of this contribute to making, helping us contribute to temperature sink.
Thank you, Cardinal.
As for the issue of nuclear, if you wanted me to go in that also.
Well, I've got fossil fuels, nuclear. What's your specific thinking around that? And is the church going to do something very clear?
Sure, we have. I mean, we began already engaging the oil and gas companies about what we call just energy transition. We've already had 3 conversations with them. A 3rd one is in the planning. It is to encourage them to embrace the idea of needing to move away from energy, from fossil fuel. And when Laudato Si was published, my first travel outside to talk about this was to Poznan in Poland, a big coal mining farm, because they thought that Pope Francis was not supportive of everything that they did as coal miners. And I had to convince them that that's not what the Pope is doing. The Pope is asking us to contemplate a transition. So this is what we do now, but let's not get stuck with this, see alternative ways of getting out of this. So that is the thing about energy transition. The thing with fossil fuel, if we can develop biogas, save more the better. And then the nuclear thing. I face a lot of people who tell me that the nuclear thing is the best option, just that we don't know yet how to deal with our waste. If we had a solution to nuclear waste, certainly that would be the cleanest form of energy. But until we are very safe with dealing with the waste and not simply dumping them in caskets at the bottom of the seas, away from where any human eye can see anything. That is still not doing it. We're just postponing the issue and passing it on to destruction of our undersea, wonders in the ocean. So in that sense, there is still a lot of homework to be done with the nuclear, with the nuclear source of energy, although it appears to be the one that safeguards the forest and everything standing. Now we still have issues with that.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn to you now, Professor Schellnhuber, because we have several questions for you, very technical questions, by the way. Some of them are around carbon capture and storage. The other is around best available technologies versus best available techniques. What for you are the key messages that need to come from scientists around the right technologies to use? And in particular, when you talk about carbon sinks as well, I think this is a very important point. What is your thinking around that? And could you reflect also on the shift that you're seeing in different countries? Because there is a question here around how the Arab world seems to be increasingly adopting renewable technologies.
Now, let me start with the last question. I mean, we see a lot of shifts now and dramatic shift, and they go often under the radar screen of the international climate discourse. I showed you what is happening in India, for example, where the air pollution is still a terrible problem, exacerbated by COVID-19, for example, in Delhi and so on. On the other hand, the electrification and often solar energy based in rural India is going forward. So you see it in many countries of the world, and it's in a way a shame that the rich Western countries are not doing their share based on their capacity, and those countries who in a way are runner-up in the industrialization in modern industrial society are doing actually more. So I think we in the West, if I speak for myself, Germany, the European Union, same is true for the United States and other countries, Australia, not to speak of Australia. I mean, we have to catch up clearly, and we should actually try to provide much, much more momentum 5 years after Paris. Now, let me make a remark also following up on Cardinal Turkson, who has been a hero and a champion in the Catholic Church. I have to say this now for a long time. Now it's really true, and we really depend on you, Cardinal. But following up on the nuclear question, now I'm a physicist by training. I do know how to construct a nuclear reactor, a fission reactor, a fusion reactor. But it is in a way stupid, apart from the waste problem the Cardinal mentioned. I mean, the best and most powerful nuclear fusion reactor in our world is the sun, actually. All the sunlight is coming from nuclear fusion. So instead of building a mediocre or a much sort of less reliable source with lots of side effects, why not trying to harvest what is given to us by creation, if you like, by the sun for free without any side effects? So improving our harvesting technology is a much smarter way than to try to create sun on Earth. So now when it comes to the overall technicalities, you see our carbon law, our roadmap for rapid decarbonization as published in Science, is looking at various sectors. So clearly the power sector, as the Cardinal said, wind, sun, and so on, this will do the job. I'm not worried about that anymore. Mobility, we can switch to battery sort of base cars, hydrogen, green hydrogen, there are many ways. Industrial production is more difficult. We can use hydrogen for steel production. It's too expensive right now, but the cost curve will come down with new innovations. There are two big problems and sectors left where we do not have a good strategy yet. One is land use, clearly, agriculture, as was mentioned. Cutting down the Amazon forest or the Congo forest or the Sumatra forest for raising more cattle is just madness in my view. So lifestyle has to actually honor, but we have to live within planetary boundaries. As you said, Sandrine, in the beginning, I completely agree with you. So we have not yet, and not even the European Union has a good strategy for dealing with agriculture so far. It's still a wasteful approach. And the fifth big sector, actually the biggest of all, is the built environment, the construction sector. And here, although we do not deserve it in our blindness, here is a golden opportunity to undo some of the big emissions of the past. And CCS, compared to that, I don't think it will ever scale. It's too costly to do it, while building your house from a much better material, which is nice, which has very good thermal properties, and you can do it without extra cost, more or less, but has a much, much bigger potential. So I would give up always geoengineering dreams and would rather go for organic architecture. This is a win-win-win strategy. And I can elaborate on that, but I would everybody advise to read also our paper in Nature, Buildings as a Global Carbon Sink, where we have done the analysis.
Thank you so much, Professor Schellnhuber, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I must say that having followed also the energy first principle at the European Union level and having worked with the European Commission, knowing full well that if we put in place the right built environment measures, that by 2030, we could totally stop our importation of gas into Europe. These are the types of figures and comparisons that we need to show people and demonstrate the way in which we can move forward. Now, Hindou, I want to come to you because there are a couple of questions here that are directed more at you. The first is around the opportunity for indigenous transnational networks. And at this time where we're really feeling the planetary emergency, how can the indigenous communities come better together? And what can we all do as scientists and economists and faith leaders to work together with indigenous communities?
Right. It is very important that we talk about indigenous peoples while we are talking about climate change. I wanted to remind that indigenous people are protecting 80%, 80, of the world biodiversity. And we are just like 5% of the world populations. And we also protect 22% of all the Earth's land. So that means the rest are the oceans. So we have like a huge knowledge around all the ecosystem that we live in it. And indigenous peoples from Amazon, as the question asked, are part of it. So when you go in Amazon around indigenous people's land, you can see that the forests are more diverse than a national park that they put a guard to protect it. Why? Because indigenous peoples in Amazon, they know how to keep the balance between the trees, the herb, the insect, between the birds, all the ecosystem that living on it. They know which kind of animals they have to hunt, which kind of fish they have to catch from the river that they have, and in which season that they have to manage to have all the resources they want. So they do not shrink all the resources. So those are a unique knowledge that they develop around Amazon. So having transboundary coalition of indigenous peoples discussing around the traditional knowledge in Amazon can be very beneficiary to the entire world, because we know that the world have Amazon, have Indonesian forest, and Congo Basin. The Amazon is the bigger one, and who is the one who help our air around all the planet to be healthier. So that's why we need to protect the knowledge of indigenous peoples in this place. Now, how they can meet together, how they can be in cooperation or coalition, that was your questions. So I think in this time of COVID, it has been very difficult for us around the world as indigenous peoples to communicate, because people living in the remote area where there is no electricity, so you can't talk about internet. But we try to exchange with those who got an internet from time to time, to see how we exchange our strategy, our traditional knowledge, to better build the resilience of our communities. And at the end of the day, we understand that if we take the decision together in the nature, and if we exchange those informations, it will be much, much better for the indigenous peoples among ourselves, but it will be also much a lesson learned for the government outside. There are a lot of things going on during this time, a lot of illegal deforestations in addition to the fire. But who are going to tackle this illegal deforestation while the government are focusing all the efforts to the COVID and all the efforts to the town? So it will be the indigenous peoples who can be the guardian of it. But there is need of support to those indigenous peoples to stop the harming of the human rights defenders, the environmental defenders who are there in the land. So if we reinforce that, we protect them, they can be better on coalition Amazonian countries, and then they can be help and exchange the knowledge and protect better the nature.
Thank you so much, Hindou. And you say so clearly that actually indigenous people are 80% of the stewards of our land and our biodiversity. And Professor Schellnhuber brings up a very good point around agriculture. And I sit on the UN Food System Summit Action Track 5, which is on resilience. And we know that we have good regenerative agricultural practices now. So I guess I have a final question to all three of you, which is that we're starting to see these nationally determined commitments coming from, so the NDCs coming from different countries. And we've got China and the US now that's coming back into Paris, and the EU all committing to about, well, definitely climate neutrality by 2050, 2060, with some 2030 ambitious goals, at least in the EU, already moving to 60%. But we know this is not going far enough. What for each of you would be the most important target to hit now? Is it in the area of energy? Is it in the area of agriculture? Is it ensuring that we take care of the stewards of the land? And for you, Cardinal, a very key question, because many of those that are engaging with us today are indicating that they do not hear the voice of the church as clearly as you express it on sustainable development through their own diocese or through their own churches themselves. How can we ensure that the faith community truly does speak to the incredible truth that you have brought forward? And the pitch from myself and Professor Schellnhuber has often been as well, how do we bring science and faith leaders together with also indigenous people and all different actors to ensure that COP26 is a successful COP and gets us over the line? So I'll start with you, Cardinal Turkson.
Well, so where to start? I mean, so I'll be tagging on to what Hindou observed, that it's not about the transnational character of indigenous, indigenous communities and all of that. The Vatican is very much promoting that. With Pope Francis, we've created a network in the Amazon called REPAM. We've created and linked them to another network in the Congo forest called REPAC. And we link them also with another network of Amazon people in the Philippines and in the Pacific Islands called ROBAB. So we've created this three network of indigenous communities almost around the same latitude in the world, which happens to be in the situation Hindou talks about, mostly taking care of natural resources, biodiversity, forests, and all of that. But coming to the question about how the church makes its voice heard. This again is an interesting kind of question, because on the world stage, Pope Francis is admired, cherished, and recognized for his moral authority, which he comes out on weighs in on all of these environmental issues. To think about Laudato Si and now Fratelli Tutti and every other statement that is made. And one would have thought that when the leader so speaks, all the followers would also, kind of come on board with whatever. But unfortunately, we have just the situation you just described. There appears to be some slight disconnect between the head and the body. So that what the Pope speaks does not always resonate with every area or with every part of the world. But that again is our task. That's our responsibility. And we started working on that with a lot of online conferences, with the bishops' conferences, and with Justice and Peace and Caritas Internationalis bodies around the world. It's an attempt to get through to the grassroots groups about this. Secondly, we have embarked on a program of promoting, as it were, climate response actions, promoting a lot of climate responses, encouraging people with solar, encouraging people with different forms of agriculture, greening and all of that. We have created a huge investment into this green belt of Dakar to Djibouti type of thing, encouraging local communities and local churches wherever this belt crosses to embark upon something. But most importantly, the action has to be on the local level. We are encouraging local churches to see how safer and how much easier and less expensive it will be if they learn to put solar roof on their churches. And we encourage a lot of them to do. This appears to be initially capital intensive. So we resorted to what you call social impact investing to bring capital to some of these areas so that they can undertake these basic, as it were, initiatives that enable them to save money, save energy, and bend down the curve. So that's how we are trying to help local communities come on board with this climate agenda.
Thank you very much, Cardinal. And Professor Schellnhuber, I'll ask you the same, and I'll add another question that I've just seen, which I find a bit fascinating, actually, because my instinct probably is pretty much the same as yours. But this question is around the fact that polluting American and Chinese industries could be transformed, and that it's the Arab world that are now moving much faster than actually the Chinese and the Americans. I would love to hear your opinion on that.
I mean, if you look back in history, when for many centuries the Arab world was leading the world, actually, and actually it was them who brought science and advanced philosophy to Europe. So the Europeans, or say Western civilization, should learn to become a bit more humble. So there is huge potential all over the planet, clearly. But let me say one thing, because referring to your previous question is, and I put myself into very big shoes, namely Martin Luther King in this case. So I have a dream, so to speak. The dream is that overcoming the corona crisis, vaccines are coming along now based on the best world-class molecular biologist researcher. And I think the crisis the emergency actually, will teach everybody that you have to be evidence-based and you have to rely on investigative minds. And so once we have overcome the corona crisis, maybe next year, when people will see that if you want to find a solution to a deep crisis, you have to be based on science actually, and reason. And here, this could accelerate what I experienced ever since I was involved in seminars by the Pontifical Academy, and which started actually in a very, very powerful way with the publication of Laudato Si, which was a very strong statement that reason and faith have to go together in order to save the world. So this is my dream, and I hope my dream will come true.
Absolutely. Hindou, would you like to say a few words, and then I will conclude?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think we know all the solutions. They are in our hand. And we know also it is very urgent. We have only 10 years that left. So the solutions can come, of course, from the solar energy to shift from the fossil fuel to the renewable energy. But the solution also can come from the leadership, the political leadership that we wanted to change. And then we saw when the people stand up, it's changed. This is the case of US, when they are come out from Paris Agreement and they're going to get in again, and they wanted to put climate change in the heart of all the activities. We are looking forward to see it's become a reality. And we know also all the world wanted to focus to net zero by 2050, but we have to understand the urgency is there. Climate change is killing peoples and it's displacing communities, it's making them homeless and migrant. So those sense of urgency have to be in the mind of all of us. We are talking in the term of the first best organization here with the Vatican. So if they do not believe on the politicians, they must believe on them first. The first might guide them. And in any religions, from the Catholic, Christians, Muslim, and all, we have one thing in common: respect the human being, respect the nature, respect all the life in the earth. So we must all respect the life in the earth together. So I'm leaving you with this note: indigenous peoples are the solutions. They are the most impacted. We are also life. So respect all the life in the earth, and we will get all what we lost to come back. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Hindou. And thank you, all three of you, for your beautiful words of wisdom. And Hindou, I'm going to build on what you've just said, and also Professor Schellnhuber, because I think that we are all cognizant of the fact that this dream cannot become a nightmare. It must become a reality. And the only way to do that is to dig deep into all of our souls. And absolutely, as you indicate, that respect for life, a life that is not about anthropocentrism, exactly as the Laudato Si indicates to us, but instead embraces all species. And we can go back to Jane Goodall, who indicated that the human being is supposedly the most intelligent, but definitely not the wisest. This is the moment when we can shine as people, because yes, we need to respect the indigenous people that are the stewards of the land. But those of us who are using your natural resources must also assume the responsibility of putting in place the targets and the timetables to stop the destruction that we are doing to this planet, which has now made us absolutely in the midst of a planetary emergency. So I am very hopeful that by working together, indigenous people, scientists, economists, and absolutely faith leaders, that the Catholic Church can continue through its wisdom and through its action to show us the way, to create also an interfaith dialogue, which is absolutely fundamental, and which together we can all work very specifically on what are those actions that we need to put in place for the next decade of action. Because our mission is not a mission to the moon. Our mission is a mission to save this home that we call planet Earth. And that, I think, unites all of us, no matter what faith, no matter what color, no matter what culture, no matter what disposition. We are all united, and we must be in this challenge. So I'm going to bid you all a wonderful day with, I hope, a ray of hope, but also a sense of responsibility that we must turn this planet into a livable planet again for all species. And thank you again, Cardinal Turkson, and all of you at the church and the diocese who have organized this very important webinar, and for the work that you are doing around COVID, the pandemic, and climate change. Thank you all very much. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.